Hey everyone, it's Alec Crawford, your host on AI Risk Reward, and our special guest today is Rutger van Faassen, founder and CEO of Information Banker. Welcome, Rutger.
Thanks for having me, Alec.
Well, it's great to have you here. It's fun to see you in person, and it's fun to have you on the show. And you know what? Speaking of that, I haven't seen many people go from hotel school right to ABN Amro in their career. So there's got to be a story there, Rutger.
Yeah, actually, there's more people than you think that actually do that. ABN Amro actually came and recruited at the hotel school, and they had a good story behind it. They said we can basically teach anyone banking, but to have a hospitable nature and be hospitable, that's something that's more ingrained. So that's why they came to hotel school and recruited a lot of people there. So actually, many of my fellow alums ended up both at ABN Amro and other financial institutions in the Netherlands.
Wow, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And you mentioned like Steve Jobs is definitely a hero of mine, and you mentioned that you admire him as well. Why? What specifically about him would you want to copy in your role, and what would you want to avoid?
So obviously, I haven't personally met him, so I only know of him through his books and everything that you see about him, the YouTube videos and everything. But he seems very considerate and very well read and has great thoughts about doing things a certain way. So that's something that I find very, very interesting about him and very fascinating. So I would love to copy some of that. One of the things he loved to do was walk and talk. That's something that I love to do as well. I think that's a great way to sort of say, hey, let's take the meeting on a walk. And as you walk, you actually exercise that actually helps your body and actually helps you make sort of better decisions and have better conversations. Now, I also understand that he was quite demanding, sometimes like to a point where people that worked for him sort of said he could be a little bit too demanding. So I would obviously hope to stay on the safe side of demanding there. I think demanding is good, but you do want people to still not talk about you like, hey, he's too demanding. That could be a problem. So that would be the one area where I wouldn't want to copy him. But I think he has done amazing things. Obviously, Apple is a very amazing organization, and he has been foundational to that success.
Yeah, yeah, great points. I mean, I love the walking and talking thing. It's hard for me to do here, being remote working, but and then what do you think Steve Jobs would think about blockchain today?
Hmm. Yeah. So I think Steve would probably get some smart people together because that was the other thing that he would do, right? He would sort of say, "Hey, I don't need to hire people and then tell them what to do. I hire people and have them tell me what to do." So he probably would get a bunch of people in a room and think through, "Hey, what is that next use case that we haven't thought about?" Right? And if you think back to some of the Apple products that were quite revolutional and really sort of changed the industry, like the iPhone. I think he could do something with blockchain. Now, the funny thing is that the Apple products are never the first ones, right? They always sort of scan the environment, look at what's happening, and then come out with something that is better than everything else that's there, right? Mobile phones were there. There were kind of these handhelds. Remember the Palms with the little stylus. But then when the iPhone came out, it was just like amazing. It was just a nudge above everything else. And I think recently Apple actually did that with Apple Intelligence, right? AI has been around, and then they just used the two letters, and instead of making it artificial intelligence, they sort of said, hey, let's repurpose that A for Apple and call it Apple Intelligence. And again, very, very smart, right? They didn't invent it, but they do sort of bring it up a notch. So I think that's probably what Steve Jobs would do with his team of very smart people. He would think about what's out there, and then he would take it up a notch and sort of say, hey, this is actually what you could use blockchain for.
Yeah, that's a good call. And then back to your career, you went to ABN Amro, and tell us about your journey from there through today to information banker.
Yeah, so I started off at ABN Amro Bank in the Netherlands, which is where I'm from, and I was born and raised there. It actually took me. I worked very closely with the management team of the mortgage bank in the United States, and that actually took me to the US. Um, then ABN Amro was acquired by a group of banks, and pieces of it were sold off. The piece that I worked for, the mortgage company, was sold to Citigroup, and I help with the sort of transition of the assets to Citi and sort of the integration. And then I actually started working for a Bay Area startup. So I actually did walk around a little bit where Steve Jobs used to hang out, like Palo Alto, San Bruno. It was kind of that Bay Area. So I actually remember going there for the first time. I was like, oh, this is actually quite exciting, right? This is where all the big tech companies are. So I worked for company called Nomus Solutions. They were a software as a service company doing price optimization and revenue management, and they helped banks and financial institutions optimize their pricing. And I was their first banker hire. They had a lot of smart people building software and a lot of smart people building predictive models, but they didn't have any people that had actually been on the banking side. So I was their first banker hire, and worked there for 10 years, working with lots of banks in both Canada and the US, which was very exciting. Then after that, doing that for 10 years, I joined Informa, large company that provides lots of things, does conferences, but I work specifically for Informa Financial Intelligence, working again with financial institutions, helping them make better decisions using insights and benchmarking. And most recently, so about 3 months ago, I actually founded my own company. So after having been in banking for 25 years and having been on both the bank side and the vendor side, I saw a lot of things happening from both perspectives. And I saw a lot of banks and solution providers try to work together. And in many cases, that actually didn't always work out. There was no connection, or it sort of missed the mark a little bit. And so I was like, well, maybe that's something I can do something about. And so I decided to start Information Banker to help solution providers in their journey and in their storytelling to financial services providers. Because I find that they are not always the best at telling a simple story that really sort of says, hey, this is what the outcome is. So I help my clients, solution providers, with their story selling to financial institutions, so banks, credit unions, and fintechs. And then it is a bit of a matchmaking business, right? So I also work very closely with people on the other side and talk to them to understand what their challenges are. And then hopefully I can provide them with a solution that is a good fit. So I provide qualified introductions of solution providers to financial services professionals.
Cool. Is there anything more about the origin story? You just woke up one day and said, I'm doing my own business, or is there something else going on there?
So I always had the idea that I wanted to do something for myself. Having been in larger and smaller organizations, it was always an organization, right? It was always working for other people. I really had the desire to do something for myself and sort of say, hey, this is where I can define what I do. When I get out of bed, I decide what I do. And I really wanted to try that out and see, hey, how is it to be an entrepreneur and run your own business? And really that kind of sense of like, hey, I can help people connect in a better way, and this is the only way I can do that. Like working for one side or for the other doesn't really sort of solve the problem. The problem only solves for me being in the middle. And what I'm doing didn't necessarily exist. There wasn't sort of like a company I could join and do this. So I was like, let me just do this myself. Let me set this up. And then maybe an interesting story about like the name. So I then had to think about like, well, what name am I going to give this company? And I had to think back to my daughter. Actually, this was before I started my company, but she asked me, hey, Dad, you're a banker, right? And this was when I already worked for Informa. And I said, well, no, honey, I'm not a banker anymore. I used to be a banker, but now I help bankers with information. And she said, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then we had a friend of my wife's over for dinner. who doesn't really know what I do because she works with my wife. And she leaned over to my daughter and sort of said, "What did your dad do again?" And then my daughter said very confidently, "My dad is an information banker." And I was like, that's such a great term. Like, information banker isn't really a word, but it describes pretty well what I do, right?
It is now.
It is now. So that's what I did. I looked up, when I decided to start my own business, I looked up whether informationbanker.com was still available. And guess what? It was. So here it is, informationbanker.com.
That's a win, and credit to your daughter. So you also mentioned an interesting book, Start With Why by Simon Sinek.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I've read it many times. I've actually, so there's the book, and then there's a workbook, Create Your Own Why, and then he does courses as well where you can create your own why. So I've gone quite deep down the rabbit hole. But what is very interesting about the book Start With Why? So Simon Sinek talks about how people buy from other people not because of what they do, but because of why they do it. And actually, our brain first starts with emotion and then puts rational thoughts to it. So it is very important to connect with someone at an emotional level. And this is exactly what I was noticing and why I started my business, because I saw all these missed connections where people would start a pitch and you taken an hour and you were like 50 minutes in and you could see the other side kind of starting to sweat a little bit and go like, I still have no idea what this company does. We're 50 minutes into the pitch. They've thrown a lot of stuff at me, but I still have no idea what this is. So instead of starting with what you do and all the technical things that you do, I actually work with my clients to say, hey, why don't we start with why? Tell me why you do what you do. What are you passionate about? Why do you get out of bed? And funny enough, in many cases, it especially for startups, it is, hey, I used to work at this firm and we had this bottleneck. This one thing would go wrong all the time. And then one day I sort of said, well, I've had enough. Like this is just so frustrating. I'm quitting my job and I'm going to fix this. And that's how a lot of startups get started. And if you tell a story like that, that makes an emotional connection with someone. People cannot not like you when you say something like that, right? It's actually quite noble that you do that. So that's something where I'm trying to apply Start With Why from Simon Sinek in working with my clients.
Yeah, that's super cool. And let's since the show's about AI, we better talk about AI.
Yeah,
So,
totally.
what are some things you use AI for?
So I have a weekly newsletter called What Did I Miss, which is basically I do a lot of posting on LinkedIn. My first client called me a finfluencer, and I've sort of adopted that term. So as a finfluencer, I do a lot of posting and sharing of information and curating of information. And at the end of the week, I sort of look at what trended, and I create this newsletter called What Did I Miss? And I use Perplexity to help me sort of sort through the full form of the article and then sort of summarize it. I use the Copilot to then put nice pictures to it. And so those are some of the things that I use. I also use a little bit of AI to help me with my sort of CRM and outreach and writing emails. So I find it quite useful. It's obviously still a new thing, right? And prompting right is something that really takes practice. But I find that it might sound trivial, right? Like putting pictures in a newsletter, but I really find that I get a lot out of the prompting experience I get from that. Because you go like, hey, I need a lemon. There was a company called Lemon Squeezy that was in the news. And I was like, okay, I need a picture of a hand squeezing a lemon. And then I put the prompt in and it came back and it was like totally not what I was thinking it would come back with. And then I had to sort of reprompt and then it came back with yet something. It's like, no, not that either. And so you had to really finally peel back the onion by really going step by step in your prompting, which again, sounds trivial, but it was very, very helpful for me to sort of go through that process and realize, hey, this is a whole new skill set that everyone has to get used to, right? This prompt engineering.
Yeah, that's fair. And maybe a year from now, we won't have to worry about that so much. But right now, you definitely need to do a little prompt engineering. And along those lines, Is AI likely to disrupt traditional banking models or enhance them? What do you think?
So it's always interesting in the beginning of a new technology, people always have a little bit of a freak out moment, right? And we've seen that with many technologies. I was reading a book, the Built for Tomorrow by Jason Pfeiffer, and he talks about how musicians were freaking out when the record came out because they said like, well, you know what, I'm out of a job because no one is gonna hire a musician if they can just listen to a record. And this was like right in the beginning, so I think it was someone from the organization of professional musicians that sort of made a statement about that and sort of said, well, this is a problem. Like, we cannot have records because it's going to destroy our business. Not thinking that they could now record records and get royalties over those records and actually make a lot more money and be in many places at the same time. So there's a little bit of that happening with AI, right? There's a little bit of a freak out moment and people go like, oh, am I going to lose my job? I always find that when there's new inventions, it will always work out in the end for the better. And people will realize that, hey, you know what? Some of these like menial tasks that I used to do that I actually didn't like doing, great. Maybe an AI agent can do that for me. And then I can actually do the fun stuff and the human in the loop, because I do believe that a human in the loop is still important, especially with something as emotional and sensitive as banking, right? It's still people's livelihood, their money, there's a lot of trust involved. So in that sense, you can make experiences better, you can do things faster, but there still will have to be humans in the loop. So I think at the end of the day, it'll be a positive.
And what regulatory challenges do you anticipate as AI becomes more integrated into banking operations, and how can banks prepare for these changes?
Yeah, so there are obviously, like with any new technology, there are some unintended consequences. There are some things that we need to learn about ourselves, right? Like, I don't think there were seatbelts until way after the car was invented, right? So we always have to sort of say, hey, where are dangers, and then how do we regulate to sort of prevent those or bad things to happen? So I think that will be one of the key things to keep an eye on, to sort of say, hey, what are we observing ourselves, and how can we then work? Because it's the other challenge always with regulators. How can we work with the regulator to inform them of what's happening, so that they can then really come with legislation and rules that is helpful? And I don't think anyone right now will debate the seatbelt in the car, right? But there's also still a lot of things that are new that, again, people might be freaked out about, that we can actually find out are not as bad as we thought they would be. So I think there'll be a little bit of that. I think the other element that we do need to think about is kind of like bias, right? That is a big thing because these large language models are all sort of trained on a set of data that has inherent biases in it. And I think that will be one of the key challenges to really think through and sort of say, how do we take biases out of it? How do we retrain models? And I think that the regulator and the government will probably have a major role in that.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. So, what else concerns you about AI, both practically and from an ethical standpoint?
Yeah, so that bias is can be problematic, right? If you train a model on a biased data set that doesn't represent everyone and all use cases, it could generate sort of outcomes that are non-desirable. So I think that's certainly one of the risks that we need to be aware of. Obviously, the hallucination is a word that has captured a lot of attention, right? That's the other kind of element of where people need to think about, hey, is this something, how can I prevent hallucination from happening? And hallucination, if it's just kind of not exactly the right thing when you're trying to say something, in some cases that's okay, right? If we're just conversationally talking about something, about like, hey, where do I find my routing number? And I sort of say, hey, you click on this tab and it's actually not that tab. Probably not the end of the world. But if you are using an AI agent to do underwriting of loans, it could be much more problematic, right? So I think by use case, we do need to have a look at that and say, hey, what are the risks here, and how many guardrails do we need to put on it?
Yeah, and also do an analysis of probability and impact and all that good stuff. Exactly.
Yeah.
Hey, we're going to turn to our advice section now.
Mm-hmm.
You've got about 25,000 followers in social media. How did you do it? What's your advice to the audience if they want more followers?
Right. Slow and steady is basically every day I would post things. I would get up in the morning, I'd read my news sites, and then I would share that. And I think that's the other element as well. Like, give value before you ask for anything, right? So I think that's very important in social selling and in anything in social media. It's not just about you, it's about people out there that are hopefully getting value from what you deliver. And then it's also important, like, whatever that number is, it's also important to sort of say, hey, are those people the right people? Are the people that are following you getting value from what you're putting out there? Because there are obviously these, I don't know, I get emails all the time with people sort of saying, hey, I can get you lots of new followers and you just pay me and then you get followers. And I'm like, yeah, that's missing the point. I'm not interested in that at all. I'm not interested in followers for followers' sake. I think it's important to have followers that hopefully get value out of what I share.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And you've got a podcast, so tell us about that and give some advice to newbie podcasters out there.
Yeah, so the podcast is called Banking on Information. And I there use the Simon Sinek Start With Why. That is actually the first question I ask my guest. Why do you do what you do? So it is actually really sort of walking the walk and just not just talking the talk. And the idea is that really creates a conversation that is empathic and people sort of learn something about the guests that I have on the podcast. I also try to keep it relatively short. I don't know, maximum 15 minutes, ideally 10 minutes, because I find that works quite well, especially when you're just doing a quick intro about someone. And yeah, so it's been quite interesting. I think I've recorded about 15 or 16 of them are on Banking on Information. In my prior role at Curanos, I was also hosting the podcast. We did 2 seasons there. So I have some experience in doing it. So if I think about any kind of like tips or tricks, it is good to have a sort of a good format where you sort of know like, hey, this is what's going to happen, because it's going to make you feel more comfortable as the host. If you know what your questions are, you know what you're going to ask, it's going to come across much more calm and collected, and you're doing a great job. So in that sense, you don't need that tip.
And pivoting back to AI, what are your best places for AI info? You mentioned to me, for example, the Pivot podcast earlier. What other sources do you have?
Yeah, so Pivot I like because it's sort of like a general, they talk about the general news, but obviously it is that combination of Kara Swisher and Prof G. I think that dynamic is actually quite good together. They have quite interesting backgrounds and discuss sort of current events. I think for AI, where I like to go, I like to go to conferences because there's a lot of them, but I do find that there's some really good conferences out there. Actually, there's one coming up, which is the AI Summit. I've been there several years in a row. Saw some really good practical use cases of how AI is being applied, because I think that's still one of the main things right now. Everyone talks about AI, but not everyone really has crystal clear what are good use cases and what are not so good use cases. So I always recommend for people to go to conferences, especially the ones that, if you can see in the agenda that there's some real life use cases being presented, I find that super helpful. I learn a lot from that.
Yeah, totally. And what else? What advice do you have for undergrads who want to become founders?
So you do need to have that sort of desire to become a founder, right? It's not just a kind of like, oh, well, everyone else is doing it, so I should be doing it. You do need to have that kind of like spirit that you sort of say, hey, I want to run my own firm. You obviously need to have an idea. Your idea doesn't always end up being the final idea. That's the other element, right? You have to pivot a lot when you start a new company and try to find product market fit. And then what is very important is try to find customers as quickly as possible. Because customers, real life customers, are the best way to test whether what your hypothesis is, whether that is actually working. And that is also usually the reason why you pivot, right? Because if you stay, sometimes you see people that are in stealth for a really long time, and they're in their garage or somewhere in a locked away place and not talking to anyone. That can be sometimes problematic, right? Then you come out of that and haven't spoken to anyone, and you think you have something, and then you talk to a first prospect, and you realize, oh, that's actually not it. Like they don't like that, they like this. So I would really encourage them to think about, hey, where do I find customers and how do I work with them?
Yeah, great advice. And besides that, what do you wish you knew before you started Information Banker?
Uh, so it sounds kind of cheesy, but how little hours there are in the day. Like obviously I was fully aware of that there's only 24 hours in the day, but actually living through it, that I find is kind of like, yes, there is so much to do when you have your own company. It is certainly not 9 to 5 and kind of like, hey, the office is closed, you go home. It's yeah, you're constantly even sort of in your mind busy with it. So that was the biggest kind of aha for me. But also something that you can only, I also noticed this when I became a father. It's very hard to explain to people what it is to have kids. Like people, again, get the concept of what children are, but like only when you have them does it sort of really hit home. And that was very similar to starting my own businesses. Kind of like, okay, so this is what it's like.
Great analogy. Yeah, I'd say, especially on the software side, make sure you have a techie person and someone doing everything else. Otherwise, there's only 24 hours in the day, as you
Yep.
say, right?
Yep.
Um, so look, the last 5 minutes, as our audience knows, is a lightning round where I mention different things and ask if you think they're underrated or overrated and why.
Mm.
So the TV show Succession, underrated or overrated?
Overrated.
AI for fraud detection at banks, underrated or overrated?
Underrated. Still long way to go.
Having a beard, underrated or overrated?
Overrated. I'm not a beer person. I'm more of a wine person.
All right. Blockchain in banking, underrated or overrated?
Underrated. Again, also still a long way to go. Many use cases that we haven't figured out yet will come in the future.
Chat GPT for looking up recipes, underrated or overrated?
That's very specific. Overrated.
Wharton online classes and certificates, underrated or overrated?
Underrated. It was. I actually did a course there that was very good. I gotta say it was very very valuable.
Perplexity AI, underrated or overrated?
Underrated. That is keep an eye on that one.
Indoor gardening, underrated or overrated?
Underrated.
Yeah, I've got some plants in my house. Customer chatbots for banks, underrated or overrated?
Still underrated.
And then finally, One of my wife's favorites, knitting as a hobby, underrated or overrated?
Totally underrated.
Yeah, I'd say underrated, but perhaps more stressful than people realize.
Yeah. No, it's well, it's that time of year again where I like to. So this is probably where that question came from. I like to knit scarves, and we it's getting cold again. So now there's sort of like lots of return from that work. So everyone in the family
Exactly.
has a knitted scarf that I have knitted for them.
Excellent, excellent. Well, you can't do 10 before Christmas, I suspect, but
That'll be hard.
I,
Yeah, no, like given everything else
that would be
going on, it's going to be hard.
that would be
Yeah.
hard. Yeah, there definitely not enough hours in the day. Anyway, this has been Rutger van Faassen, CEO of Information Banker. So, Rutger, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Alec, for having me. Always a pleasure.